I'd like to welcome Benjamin Phillips, and thank you for doing an interview with us and answer some questions that we've received about your artwork with your exhibition happening here at the Ottawa School of Art and at the Shankman Centre currently. And absolutely thrilled to have your work here. And so we'll just get right into some questions.
Thanks.
So I guess the first question that a lot of people would have coming into the show, as well as one that was specifically sent in, was what was your inspiration for this body of work?
That's a good question. I think looking back at when I started this body of work, I was looking at, because I had traveled for the first time out of the country into a country that I didn't speak the language. And I was very alone with the language, my language that didn't relate to the language that I was traveling with. So I was very aware. And traveling alone, there's no safety net a lot of times.
And where did you go?
I was traveling in Rome on scholarship for my thesis exhibition. I won a scholarship to travel for summer research, and chose Rome because of its collection of antiquities that were made there and presented at one time in that city when it was a populous ancient city. And there would be examples of large-scale and more private, natural scale figurative art, because at the time sculpture was the medium of visual communication, either for propaganda or for private collection. And I was looking at that, and because it's a hotspot for tourism, because of art, culture, and the Vatican, there's a lot of people from all over the world. And I did, between afternoons in intimate museum settings to shoulder with people from all over the world, I did a lot of studies of bodies, moving bodies, and static bodies, and the work became a real study of movement as a contemporary study of the body. A static, still body didn't mean as much to me, and I could do a series of figures in motion with simple variations that could allow for all kinds of different directions. So back to the question, I was thinking a lot about being alone and that private bubble of not being, of sort of reflecting on everything and being surrounded by so many people but not knowing anyone and being very alone. Really impregnated the whole series with that perspective.
Excellent, very nice. So when you're working on a specific piece, do you plan ahead what you're going to be trying to emote with that piece? Or does it sort of evolve in its own way?
I think it'd be best to quote another sculptor, Maury Baden, who was teaching, I just retired when I was at the University of Victoria. He was a sculptor there. And what he approached sculpture, because he's a kinetic artist, he thought of emotion and would just give it form. And with this, similar, I'm thinking I would be captivated by how someone moved or carried their body, or just had a particular look. And those small fragments of that I captured and sort of resonated with, I would give that a form.
Excellent. And with the sculptures, you're doing body casts, correct? Yeah. And so,
Mostly,
yeah. And so you've cast many different people. And so how do you decide how you're going to assemble the pieces together for a piece? Like, they're not all one individual.
Right.
Correct?
Yeah. It's a little macabre, I guess, but I started a collection of casting body parts, so I have a library of casted body parts. And it just meant that I had these rudiments that I could, like Lego building blocks. I would work with a form, and I'd have or an idea of how the body should be, and to counterbalance, balance. I'd use the parts to assemble accordingly. The fact that they're body castings, for me, that made a lot of sense, and it was important to each work because there was real contact with a real person. Even though each figure is not a real person. I like that duality of, it's supposed to mean something, but like with photography, it isn't really a reference of reality. It could be. But there's also a narrative, and there's an overlay that can influence all of that. I really wanted to provide it's really important for the work to draw the viewer in close and intimate, and allowing parts to have detail from, like, the hair sticking out from the arm or something like that. It's curious, but it also, at that point when the viewer is sort of decoding the puzzle of the form, because it's all these different parts, that sort of makes sense. It's familiar, but it's not. I find that it's a catalyst or a trigger for more personal reflection in the viewer's mind, that it starts becoming a personal narrative for the person who's looking at it and trying to make sense of it. And it can become their story instead of this prescribing some sort of identity of somebody or something, which I find that really amazing on how our brains works.
Yeah.
It's part of it.
Absolutely. So you touched a little bit on how you achieve balance with the assembly. Is there any other aspect that goes into making sure that the piece balances? I mean, your pieces stand individually in such a beautiful way, and I think part of what really brings them in that way is that there is no external structure. They really stand individually.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's relevant to the work often. Some of these have pedestals, but or plinths, but that ties in with what each figure is doing. But for the figures that are standing on the ground, I think it's relevant that they're sharing the space entirely with the viewer. It's real space, but it's clearly not a real person. I think it adds to that. It is contemporary. it's contemporary sculpture to be sharing the space in a sense, especially with the body. And I also think it is that that connection that you're sharing space is another layer on that the puzzle that the viewer has to unravel. In making connections with that. It's just furthering that along, that there is something that it relates or could relate. And it also enhances the idea of how fragile this or any of these figures are. But I'm speaking figuratively, but also it's also tied in with the scale and being no taller than 5 feet. I was thinking of my grandmother or a young person. You don't approach them as you would approach a regular size, sort of a middle-aged person or a young adult. It's very different out of respect and out of you don't want to break anybody. But my grandmother was in her 90s, and she was no taller than 5 feet. She was a taller woman, but as your spine retracts, and there's a visually seeming embrittlement, and I don't think that's true. She's a very, very strong woman, but I wanted to use that personal reference to how you engage these sculptures. And that was one of them.
Yeah, because it is incredibly engaging when you approach them. But that sense of balance with all of the pieces really draws you into them.
Right.
Like that slight, they're static, but they're not static. There's that sense of movement in them.
Well, we've seen the body in motion in art in so many different ways. And I was looking at painting and drawing just as much as video, as much as sculpture. And equally as relevant when you look at Francis Bacon, sort of his twitch, is what made his characteristic contributions. One thing, so they're static figures, but there's a psychological twitch that it's amazing in that way. Or Edward Muybridge, his study of bodies in motion. A lot of the times I would look at his photography and reenact them really slowly over and over until I found a balance. And then again, as I'm trying to recreate that for the viewers, I'm putting myself into that stance and then trying to create that in the figure as much as I'm trying to get the viewer to engage and sort of see them empathize with that in the same final product. So really looking at movement and where that transitional state of balance, off balance, is where there's just an almost breaking point.
Yeah.
To tie in as another layer to that emotional fragility of the work.
And I guess also partly tied in with that, the idea that they're all white as well. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to that choice?
Yeah. Some people would say that sculpture, a white sculpture, speaks more clearly of sculptural, like a modern presentation of sculpture in some sense, because it is about how the light it's all about light, form, and mass. For me, I would say that it ties it into completely cerebral. It's an idea in three-dimensional form. With pigmentation as well, it makes it, especially with such emotionally visceral work, that when you add color, they become very loud. And I really want to I worked at softening the composition so that the viewer would get intimate with the work and not be repelled. Works by Edward and Nancy Keepwalls were things that I was looking at of contemporary examples of sculpture. And they made figuration with pigmentation and a lot of sticky, like you let glue, or they both let often there'd be glue and paint just allowed to drip. And it works for their work, but it makes it very loud emotionally, and it's difficult to be intimate for any amount of time with a shouting person. And I wanted to find a quieter way of speaking loudly but softly at the same time about what I had to say as opposed to social sort of injustices or things like that. This is a more personal sort of empathizing with a stranger in a very private moment.
Because it's quite interesting that between the stature and the whiteness, the idea that they're segmented or assembled body parts, but they're engaging. They're not macabre or aggressive. They're actually just engaging. You want to go sort of see what they're thinking. And so that, they just pull you in instead of sort of, as you said, yelling at you.
Also, I think it does tie in with it makes a reference to some of the source material that I was looking at as well, sculpture from antiquities. They may have been pigmented in their youth, but 2,000 years later, they're much more monotone. They may, I think that's also making that sort of historical.
What was your most useful step in becoming an artist? And what would you, I guess, recommend to a young artist moving forward?
Put the time in and believe in yourself. If what you're doing, you can see the value in your own self. That when you believe in yourself, that what you're doing is relevant. It may not bring money. I mean, that's a measure that you should feel grateful for, but it's not a be-all, end-all. I make art because it's something that I have to do. I get depressed, and sort of without that sort of personal exercise in that. It's as equally important as reading, as exercising, physically exercising, just for your own health. And if you can make the time for at least 20 hours a week, regardless of what your day job is, you'll see relevant progress. And eventually you'll stop either having to explain to yourself why it's important or explain to your friends why it's important, because you'll start getting recognition, probably. And that certainly is a game changer as well. When someone else, a stranger, makes a connection with the world, it validates, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what are you working on next?
We got a couple of projects in the middle, but I guess a direct reference to the work that you see in this exhibition is that I'm taking the vulnerability of this work and the body in motion and the classical reference in a new direction that I'm working with natural scale. So I'm 6 feet tall, so I'll make a figure about that height, but out of a material that appears fragile instead of has an emotional fragility to it. It's more of a direct reference to the Koros figure from ancient Greece, of a figure stepping forward into space. But at this time it is not a youthful rich kid whose parents could afford a memorial sculpture, but more of looking at a transient person that has to keep in motion. So the contrapposto of the shifted weight and the connecting the mental exercise or the mental stimulus of telling the muscles. So having the brain and the muscles reference in the form as a traditional contrapposto, and taking that a step further to the moment of engagement, to run, to get out of sight, but not in the act of running, but in just the initial engagement. So it's a little awkward. It isn't beautiful in that sense. There is still a beauty to it, but it's the few that I've made so far, there's somewhere between awkward and beautiful. And for me, that says a lot. Maybe it's just how I am. I feel most of the time. It's like, even in my better days, I feel awkward. But the material itself is like faux fragile. I wanted to make a figure like you would, like an archaeologist would recreate a broken vessel of ceramic that they found it uncovering something that's over 2,000 years old. But that kind of shards. So shards of one figure. So as opposed to the fragments of the many different sort of weird references, personal references that make a figure in these, it's more of the whole figure broke into 100 pieces and then is reassembled with a lot whenever it was found. And casting it in an earth casting, so I dig a hole and then whatever impression I can get from a body, a living body, then that is used in the forming of the figure. So it looks fragile instead of being emotionally fragile. And yeah, it's still in the working stages, but these are the ideas that I referenced.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Super. Well, I'll look forward to seeing that as well.
Yeah, me too.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah.
And telling us a little bit more about the show.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.